We're there for you, first thing in the morning, and when you get home at night. We're there for you in the heart of your evening. Today, Nightly News with Tom Brokaw. Dateline. NBC News, America's news leader.
The internet is fast becoming a primary communications vehicle for individuals, corporations, and government agencies. From 1995 to 96, internet use doubled to 34 million individuals. But the net has struggled to keep up with the demand, and there have been problems. All this week we'll be examining the net in a special series called The Tangled Web, Who Controls the Internet? MSNBC Internet correspondent Mary Kathleen Flynn is here with us with the details. How are you?
Hi, Ed.
Good.
Well, the internet may be more than 30 years old, but it really acts more like an awkward, gangly teenager. It's gone through a major growth spurt. As you said, the number of people using it has doubled, according to some research houses, and now we're up to 34 million people. And I think there's, a real question as to whether or not it can handle its own popularity.
Now, we've heard of late in the news, America Online had huge problems with keeping up with the demand once they changed their pricing structure.
Exactly.
Is that something that's going to be ongoing?
Well, America Online, they're the largest internet service provider, and they've got about 8 million customers now. And they really had trouble keeping up with this influx of new customers. And even though that's one company, and certain people argue that maybe the problem is that they have not made a big enough investment in it, it does beg the question, are there infrastructure problems with the internet? And you will be taking a look at that.
What other problems can we anticipate perhaps coming up because of the demand?
Well, anytime a site gets really popular, it seems to have trouble handling it. For example, anytime we have a storm, you can't get on the national weather sites. Election night was a particularly classic example where people couldn't get on the internet sites that they wanted to check with the latest poll results. And Inauguration Day, we saw the same problem. So anytime a site gets really popular, people seem to underestimate how many users will try to log on.
So we really almost have to treat this as a fledgling operation, if you will, just coming into its own. You likened it to a teenager.
Exactly. It's still immature. However, there are a lot of great creative things being done on the internet, and a lot of people are pouring resources into them, and we'll be taking a look at good sites as well.
Why do people bother with it at all? I mean, is it just a passing fancy, or is it just something that is so attractive you can't live without it, if you will?
Well, there are billions of dollars being poured into it by corporations, and there are a lot of creative things being done on the internet with multimedia, audio, video. We're starting to see more and more interesting things. Just last week, Real Video came out, and that means that there'll be a lot more video clips out on the net. There's already a fair amount of audio clips out there.
All right, here's the $64,000 question. Does it get better before it gets worse, or vice versa?
I think we're going to have to take a look at that. In a few minutes, we'll be talking to Bob Metcalf, and he's one of the people who first sounded the alarm that there may be major problems on the internet. And I'm curious to see what he thinks, if it's going to get worse before it gets better.
All right, MK, I know you've worked very hard with it, and you'll be here with us all week explaining that, and we'll have much, much more to come in just a few moments. And there it is up on our net.
Right, we've got
Web.
a lot of articles up on our website, MSNBC.com, about the Tangled Web as well.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Ed.
You'll be back with more in just a minute, right? All right, and we will be back with more in just a moment, right after this break. Stay with us.
We're back with our special series called The Tangled Web, Who Controls the Internet? And I'm Mary Kathleen Flynn, MSNBC's Internet correspondent. Today's theme is the coming of age on the Internet. Inventors and innovators like Bob Metcalf helped bring it to where it is now. Bob invented Ethernet, a networking technology. He's also one of the first people to identify big problems on the net, and he's joining us now from our Portland, Maine affiliate, WCSH-TV. Hi, Bob.
Hi, how are you doing?
Hi. You predicted that the internet would collapse in 1996. Now, obviously, the net is still up and running, but are you still concerned that there might be a major collapse of the internet?
Well, I use the word collapses now. I've learned my lesson. The internet suffers outages every day, and some are worse than others. I call the big ones collapses, and they're continuing and getting worse.
So you're referring to the kinds of problems that America Online has seen. Also, I would assume when a site gets too popular and people can't log on. How do you account for those kinds of problems?
Well, there's several kinds of problems. One is not being able to log on. Another is experiencing the general slowness of the net. And a third one is just outages of the network or portions of the internet.
Where do you consider the internet most vulnerable?
It's most vulnerable in the backbone infrastructure. In other words, the bogging down has many causes, but the collapses occur, that is, the large outages occur among the internet service providers.
Well, I think it might help if you described a little bit the backbone of the internet. What is its basic architecture?
Well, the job of the internet is to carry packets, data packets, from computer to computer, and it does that through a series of intermediate computers called routers. And when we connect to the internet, we connect through an internet service provider who then takes our packets from our computer and switches them to the servers we want to connect to.
Well, one thing I wonder about when we talk about the concept of a major collapse of the internet, it's broken up into so many different components. What would a collapse be? What's your worst nightmare of what might happen to the internet?
Well, a collapse is a matter of degree, and most of the big collapses we've had so far, we had two prominent ones last year, involved only a single internet service providers. Unfortunately, these were two of the largest internet service providers, so they affected hundreds of thousands and even millions of users at a time. The internet itself does have the potential for very large collapse that goes across ISPs. I'm still expecting one of those eventually, if not this year.
Many people say that the problems with the internet are solvable, certainly the computer industry executives I talk to. Do you think that these problems are solvable?
Of course, they are solvable. They're being solved. I just wish they would hurry up.
Solve them more quickly. Well, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you think needs to be done to improve this whole infrastructure?
Well, the first thing that needs to get fixed is measurement. That is, there are very poor systems for measuring the performance of the internet. So everyone's allowed to have their own perception and their own subjective assessments of performance. People are allowed to lie about performance because we don't have a systematic process of measurement. And then after measurement would come management. That is a cooperative process among competing internet service providers to manage the net operationally. And then the third thing we need is money.
Now, you said a moment ago that you're predicting some bad times ahead. Could you give us some more details? What do you think we'll see in 97?
Well, I think to answer the question that was asked much earlier is that I think it is going to get worse before it's going to get better. That is, the bogging down will get worse. That is, the number of times that internet users have to hit the stop button on their browsers because they're not getting any response from the server, or the inability to dial into the net will get worse, and the outages, that is, not being able to get into the net, get a dial tone and get in, but not get any response. I think the frequency and duration of those will get worse in the coming year. In 96, I predicted a thing I called the gigalapse, or 8 gigalapse, which would be 1 billion lost user hours in a single episode. The gigalapse did not occur in 96, so I'm eating crow, but I still think it's ahead.
All right, well, thank you very much for joining us, Bob Metcalf. And we'll be back in just a moment with more of our Tangled Web series. Stick with us. This is MSNBC.
It can be slow at times, and also the information can be irrelevant. A lot of the links and the stops along the way, the information superhighway are kind of like bad rest stops, on the interstate. You don't really want to pull off there, but you don't have a choice.
Welcome back to MSNBC. I'm Mary Kathleen Flynn. Helping us weave our way through the Tangled Web series will be two of our MSNBC.com correspondents. Alan Boyle is in our MSNBC.com newsroom, and Brock Meeks, who's here with me in the studio. And we've also got Omar Wasso, an MSNBC contributor and president of New York Online. And each of you will be looking at different elements of this series this week. And I think we'll start with Alan Boyle, who is looking at the infrastructure of the internet and the problems there. Hi, Alan.
Hi, Mary.
Why don't you give us start out by talking a little bit about the infrastructure of the internet? What is it?
Well, when engineers talk about the internet infrastructure, they're generally talking about the collection of roads and bridges and streets that connect all the communities in the country. So when we're talking about it in terms of the internet, we're talking about not one single thing, but a collection of many things, many computers, many routers, high-speed cables, and everyone has to take care of their little piece of the infrastructure of that big collection that makes up the internet. If they don't, then you get the traffic jams, the roadblocks, the slowdowns that Bob was talking about. It's as if you were trying to go from New York to Seattle, but Iowa and Minnesota are closed down and you've got to go around.
Okay, nice analogy, Alan. What are the major areas of vulnerability when it comes to the infrastructure?
A lot of people say that it's actually the computers that you're trying to connect to. When you go to a website, for example, you have to connect with the computer on which that information is housed. And if the computer isn't high-powered enough, and if they don't have enough accommodation to get into that computer, then you're going to basically get a busy signal. It may be the sort of busy signal you see on AOL where you can't even dial into their computer, or you may just get kind of a gray screen and nothing happening because they can't handle that traffic.
Okay, thanks, Alan. Another area of controversy is the policy issues and the role that the government should play. And Brock Meeks is covering that for us. Hi, Brock. Hi. So why don't you give us an idea of the basic issues when it comes to policy and the internet?
Well, really, in Washington, what it's all about here is control. Everybody's fighting for kind of hands-off or hands-on kind of control issues. There's a lot of people that want to put more regulation on the internet to do everything from controlling content to looking at the way people are marketing things on the internet to tax issues. So we have the control issue. There's also issues of content. There's also issues of crime and what happens with the criminal aspects and some of the security measures.
What is the Clinton administration's sort of overarching philosophy about the internet, or their main position?
Well, the Clinton administration preaches a hands-off policy, but they stand ready to slap new regulations on the internet whenever they feel it's not quite going the way that it should. So there's this kind of, we'll let the internet go as far as we think it should go, but if we see it coming into any kind of trouble, we're going to slap some regulations on it. One of those issues, like Bob was talking about, where people lie about measurements and stuff, one of the real possibilities is this year we might see the FCC come down and impose what is called an Internet Reliability Council to try and make sure that these areas of outages, these issues of measurement, are set to some kind of standards.
What about some other issues like, say, encryption? That's a controversial one.
Yeah, well, the encryption issue, of course, is how you encode messages to keep your private messages private. Law enforcement says that's a big problem for them because it hinders investigations. Privacy right advocates say that's an intrusion on my privacy if law enforcement can get easy access to my encrypted messages.
But the Clinton administration's proposed this compromise about the keepers of the key, if you will.
Right. Well, the White House likes to say this is a balance between law enforcement needs and privacy issues. Unfortunately, that balance is impossible so far to find. Law enforcement says we need access to that. You give a third key to somebody so that we can have access to it under lawful warrant. Privacy advocates say that's an intrusion of privacy. It can be too easily abused.
And Omar, you spend a lot of time on the internet involved in cultural issues. How do you see the community of the internet responding to these the threat of government control?
Well, just as you were talking about the internet culture sort of coming of age, I mean, what we're going to focus on Thursday is this idea of the internet going from being this kind of world of academics and defense industry folks and just sort of, amateurs, people who are goofing around, to all of a sudden growing up and having lots and lots of industry, and that there are all these people who were hobbyists are now running companies, and in the same way, big companies are getting involved, and the government sort of saying, okay, well, now we need to play a role. And I think the reaction from most of the people who participate on the internet is we don't need the help of the government, and we don't want. I get emails daily about, the FCC is doing this, the FCC is doing that. I mean, people are actually, I think, pretty hostile to the government role on the net.
So quickly, I'm going to ask each one of you. Omar, what's your worst nightmare of what could happen to the internet?
I think the worst nightmare for me is that it actually becomes really bland and that it stops being the sort of wild and free culture that it is. Okay,
and Alan Boyle over there in Redmond talking about infrastructure. What's your worst nightmare of what could happen to the internet?
That it just becomes so irrelevant or impossible to use that it kind of becomes the CB radio of the 21st century.
Okay. And Brock, how about you?
My fear is that the government will impose so many different kinds of regulations on it that there'll be this incredible chilling effect. People won't know what they can do, when they can do it, or where they can do it, and they'll just pull back from being on the net.
Okay, well, we'll be talking to each one of you about each of these issues. Alan Boyle will be looking at infrastructure and all the problems inherent in the infrastructure of the internet. And Brock Meeks will be looking at policy, covering the scene from Washington, D.C. And Omar will have right here in the studio talking about culture issues come Thursday. Thanks for joining us now. We'll be back in a moment. We're going to take a break, and we'll be back with more on the Tangled Web. Stick with us. This is MSNBC. Oh, we're back. I'm Mary Kathleen Flynn, internet correspondent for MSNBC, and I'm here with Ed Gordon.
Absolutely she is, and there's a little confusion, but we're going to get it together now. We want to talk about what is on our website, is that right? And what people can find this week during the Tangled Web series?
Exactly. As we look at our Tangled Web series, of course, there are lots of interactive elements. You can go take a survey where we want to ask people what they think about the internet and what the basic problems are. And we've also got something where you can vote. I'm not sure voting is quite the right word, but you can identify the people that you think are the most dangerous to the internet. If you think that there are individuals out there who pose a threat, you can tell us who they are. And also, we'd like to get lots of email from our viewers about what they think about the internet.
Now, we were just showing some of that, but when you say people who are dangerous, are you actually talking about people that perhaps parents have found concern about, or how do you really mean that?
Well, I'd like to see how the audience interprets it. I wasn't thinking of that. I was thinking more like people who have control over aspects of the internet. Perhaps there are people, certainly there are what I call cyber libertarians, who might think that the Clinton administration is dangerous to the internet. There may be other people who think that various heads of big business companies, Omar Wasso was talking a moment ago about how he was concerned that the internet might get more bland as corporations join the fray. So there may be those kinds of individuals. I wasn't thinking so much of pedophiles. Although one of the things that we will be looking at is how to protect your children from people on the internet and how to train them to be wary of individuals who might pose a threat.
Let me ask you something off the cuff. Do you expect the internet to be vastly different 5 years from today than what we know?
I do, and I'm not particularly good at looking in the crystal ball and predicting what it will be. We're going to be talking to a lot of industry leaders this week about what they think the future will be. But I think just as people could not predict what films would look like, initially when people started making movies, they just filmed stage plays. I think we may be at that kind of a juncture with the internet, and it'll be very exciting to see how people change the medium.
All right, well, great. We'll be looking forward to it all week.
Thanks, Ed.
All right, that's it for me. John Siegenthaler takes over this role, and he'll take you through most of the afternoon. So we'll see you in just a few moments. Right now, we're going to continue our week-long series, Tangled Web, Who Controls the Internet? And if you got caught in the recent cyberspace traffic jam with long waits and busy signals, you know exactly what we're talking about. We're going to look into several aspects of this ever-growing part of our lives and examine its vulnerabilities. Our MSNBC internet correspondent, Mary Kathleen Flynn, is here to guide us through the Tangled Web series. MK, welcome.
Hi, Ed.
I want to talk about the popularity, obviously, of the internet. We've been talking about that really since we've been up since July, but we never have really focused in on the idea of whether or not its popularity is growing too fast and whether the infrastructure can handle it.
Right. Has it grown too fast for its own good? Last year, the population of internet users doubled. It looks like we've got 34 million people using the internet today, and there's a real question about whether or not the infrastructure can handle it. I had a chance to speak with Bob Metcalf, who founded 3Com, about his predictions that the internet might collapse.
In '96, I predicted a thing I called the gigalapse, or 8 gigalapse, which would be 1 billion lost user hours in a single episode. The gigalapse did not occur in '96, so I'm eating crow, but I still think it's ahead.
not everybody is as pessimistic as Bob Metcalf, but there's one perspective, and we'll be talking to many industry leaders throughout the week about their perspectives.
We were talking this morning about the Sports Illustrated website, and don't quote me on these figures, but I think they said they got like 6,000 hits in 3 minutes or something crazy like that, something astronomical. When you look at figures like that, I mean, it really is something that no matter what you do, it's going to be hard to deal with that kind of number at this point, isn't it?
Right, and certainly one of the problems that we're seeing with these overcrowded websites is that people are underestimating how popular they might be. That's certainly what happened on election night and on Inauguration Day. Today, one of our themes is the infrastructure. We're going to take a good hard look at the infrastructure and whether or not it's up to snuff. And we've got something on MSNBC.com that can help explain to people just what the infrastructure is. That's what I've got up here on the computer screen. And Ed, it's pretty complicated. You start out, you're at your computer, and maybe you've pressed on a hyperlink to a website. That request has to go through the phone lines, then to a service provider, say America Online or MSN or AT&T WorldNet. Then it's going to go to a network access point, which is a gateway, a regional network, perhaps another regional network. Then it's going to go to the backbone of the net, which we'll be looking at in just a few minutes. And then finally, that message will go to the computer that the information is actually stored on. That's just to send the request out. Now, to get the information back, it's got to loop all the way back there to your computer again. So there are lots of way stations and middlemen and places where it could get hung up.
Now, and that was my question. How much of this truly is part of other folks just making money along this highway? In terms of the actual function, how many of these steps could be eliminated?
Well, the problem is that the internet is not a monolith. It's a network of networks, and so it was never designed to be one cohesive structure. So at the moment, though, in its current state, you've got to have a lot of different way stations along the way. They can't just be cut out. But yeah, there are a lot of opportunities for making money along the way. That's true.
And safe to say the people in the Silicon Valley areas and all of the other areas who are putting this stuff together are working on ways of handling these numbers?
I think in particular the problems that America Online has had has given kind of a wake-up call to the entire industry, and everybody's beefing up their systems now.
All right, MK, I'm going to step aside for a little bit. You'll be taking us through the Tangled Web after this break, right?
Thanks, Ed.
All right, we'll be back in just a moment. Stay with us.
Well, I think the internet brings you out to a whole new world out there. I mean, I've used it for travel, you know, looking to book flights and so forth, sports information, and I have friends who are online who are, you know, other parts of the country, so I get to, you know, communicate with them as well. So that makes it a lot of fun.
You're connected to MSNBC, and we're continuing with our Tangled Web series. Today, we're focusing on the infrastructure of the net. Joining us now from our MSNBC.com newsroom is correspondent David Bowermaster. Hi, David.
Hi, Mary.
You've been taking an in-depth look at the infrastructure of the internet. What have you found so far?
Yeah, well, as you mentioned in the introduction to this piece, there's clearly, there are a lot of strains increasing on the network. You mentioned that there's over 30 million people on the network now, and that's a pretty staggering number when you consider that just 10 years ago there was only a few thousand university researchers and government officials using the network. So anytime you have that kind of exponential growth, there's going to be strains that come up in the system. At the same time, of that 30 million users, an increasing number of them are using applications that require a lot of data to be pumped back and forth across the network. Applications like real audio, interactive graphics, those require a lot of information, and the increasing amount of information being pumped across the network also creates pressure. So clearly there are a lot of new strains being placed on the internet. The question is, can the network handle them all? Any indication? The news from cyberspace is not very encouraging.
The public's concerns about the level of service or the lack of service have been known quite prominently for several weeks.
AOL subscribers have been met with persistent busy signals, brownouts, and frustration, putting the company on the defensive.
You wanted flat rate unlimited use, and we delivered. But we underestimated the demand.
And leading others to surmise that the internet has grown too big, too fast.
This is sort of one of those awkward growth periods where the infrastructure is perhaps a bit behind the demand for the internet today.
Another problem is the aging phone system.
The Bell operating companies essentially built out their infrastructure to allow for relatively short periods of voice conversation between you and myself, let's say. But it wasn't specifically designed for the longer connection times prevalent with internet use.
That's one reason much of the so-called internet bottleneck occurs before users even reach the net. In that netherworld, when your modem is trying to connect with your service provider's modem, their equipment guides your traffic to the main internet corridor.
This is one on-ramp to the information superhighway. Internet traffic from all over the Pacific Northwest comes into this bank of machines. It's then flowed into this bank of machines, which are known as routers. These routers then switch the traffic and then direct it into this bank of machines, which are tied into the national network. From here, it's sent all over the rest of the country.
Modest-looking wires like this one make up the national high-speed backbone. These so-called fat pipes can propel data at speeds up to 2,000 times faster than a conventional modem. But even here, gridlock sets in. Creative solutions are in the works. One is called Internet Protocol version 6.
IPv6 holds the promise of being able to differentiate high priority versus low priority delivery by individual communication. Much the way you can choose to send a package to the East Coast either via FedEx for overnight delivery or via third-class bulk mail for delivery in a week or so.
Another potential solution is straight out of science fiction. A company called Teledesic, funded by billionaires Craig McCaw and Bill Gates, plans to launch 840 satellites so you can get high-speed internet access anywhere on the planet.
So we'd be putting up a global constellation of satellites that would provide the satellite equivalent of an optic fiber access link anywhere in the world.
Teledesic's system will cost $9 billion and is at least 5 years away. If it works, it could make the busy signals and backups of today ancient history. So
Mary, as you can see, there's obviously quite a few issues to talk about when you're talking about the internet's congestion. It's obviously not one simple thing here and there, and there are quite a bit of innovative solutions being looked at to fix those problems.
All right, great, David. Thanks. There's a lot of good issues for us to keep looking into. We've got a couple of guests I'd like to bring into the equation now. Stag Newman is with me in the studio. He's Vice President of Network Architecture and Technology at Bell Communications Research. Stag, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
We've also got Royce Holland, and Royce is joining us from our Dallas bureau. He's president of MFS Communications. Hi, Royce. Nice to see you.
How are you doing, Mary Catherine?
Very well, thank you. Stag, let's start with you. I'd like to ask each of you, do you think that the current phone system is up to snuff when it comes to the internet?
Yes and no. I think the backbone network will be able to handle the explosive growth. A single fiber today can carry all the voice traffic leaving a city. The new routers will have 10 times the capacity of a voice switch, and the backbone network is many, many different networks. It's MFS, it's the local telephone companies, it's AT&T. I think we'll solve that problem. I think the real problem is we've got a backbone network of supersonic transports and jumbo jets and high-speed rail links. We've got a local network that is horse and buggy and dirt paths, and the real challenge is to change out that local network, which takes a lot of capital, a lot of time, so all of us can get on and off this superhighway other than by horse and buggy.
Okay, and Royce Holland from MFS, same question. Do you think that the phone system is up to snuff when it comes to the net?
Mary Catherine, the phone system today, I agree that the primary bottleneck is the local loop. However, we are looking at the infancy of the internet today, and for us that are in the business, I think it's a great problem to have. We've seen explosive growth the last 2 years in usage. No doubt there's a huge demand out there, but I think you could use the analogy that the internet itself today is much like transcontinental airline service was in the 1940s, where to go from New York to Los Angeles, you had to make 18 stops and it took 2 to 3 days. The internet is a lot like that today in some respects. I think that it will grow very rapidly to accommodate it, but I agree the big problem is the local loop. I think the congressional legislation last year, as that is implemented, will go a long way to solve that.
Okay, well, I think we'll get into some of those issues in just a moment, and we're going to take a brief break now. When I come back, I'll have all three of my guests, Stag Newman, Royce Holland, and David Bowermaster. Stick with us. Welcome back to MSNBC. We're continuing now with our Tangled Web series, and I've got a few guests with me to talk about the infrastructure of the internet. In the studio here is Stag Newman from Belcor, and we've got Royce Holland joining us from our Dallas bureau, and David Bowermaster from MSNBC.com. Stag, let's start with you again. One concern that comes up about the infrastructure is, are there going to be two, one for businesses and one for homes?
Today we really have two. Large to medium businesses can afford high-speed links and fiber. Today, small businesses and homes get on the network usually over copper and a dial-up modem. And the difference in speed on those is 1,000 times or more. So we already have two networks today, the one for corporate America and the one for you and I. And the problem is how you and I can get that high-speed access.
How can we get it cheaply and efficiently?
Basically, there are four alternatives. The long-range goal would be fiber to every home, but that's very expensive because you got to dig up streets. It turned out when they put the telegraph system in, it took 10 people could do a mile a day. Today, 10 people do a mile a day of fiber. Some things don't speed up in 100 and some years. So near term, we can either put electronics on the copper network, electronics on a coaxial cable TV network, or go with wireless.
Okay, Royce Holland from MFS Communications. Can you tell us more about what role you see wireless communications and cable, for instance, playing in the infrastructure of the net?
Yes, Mary Catherine. I think wireless and cable definitely has a role to play as far as solving that bottleneck in the last mile that Thad talked about. And indeed, he's right. With a small business or in the residential market, you're not going to have the access in that bottleneck. I can give you a dramatic example of that. The other day, one of my coworkers sent me a large file over our intranet, which runs at 10 million bits per second.
Right, and
I received it almost.
I just wanted to point out what an intranet is, that it's a network within a company. But go ahead, I'm sorry to interrupt.
Right. That's correct. And I received it at a full 10 million megabits. I turned around, sent that file to another coworker at their home. They had a 14,400 kilobit modem. It took them 30 minutes to get that same file. That was a factor of 700 times. Cable, certainly broadband cable connections with coax, putting modems on cable, certainly has the potential to bring that to the residents. I think, though, I agree with that. In the near term, the real key is upgrading those local copper loops with electronics to digital subscriber loop technologies that can cut a lot of that. Instead of maybe being 1/700th as fast as what I would receive on a corporate intranet, you could get into the range to where the home or the small business could get it 1/50th as fast, which is a dramatic improvement.
Okay, and David Bowermaster from the MSNBC.com newsroom. I wanted to ask you about, briefly, regulations that you see coming down the pipe from the government.
Well, again, one of the biggest issues, which I would like to ask our guests about too, is there's a question of access charges. Right now, when you make a call to the internet, you connect through your local phone network, as we've discussed. But the internet providers don't have to pay the phone networks anything to connect those calls right now because of an exemption that was created several years ago to try to facilitate the growth of the network. But right now the FCC is looking at possibly adding access charges and making those internet service providers pay that, and that could be a pretty big issue for both sides.
Okay, thanks, David, and Stag Newman and Royce Holland. When we come back, we'll have more with the Tangled Web. Stay with us at MSNBC.
Slow, but that's a hardware problem, I think, though. I wish it was faster for the average person. It takes a while to get everything you want off the internet.
All right, back with more on the Tangled Web. Before we wrap up this segment of the Tangled Web series, there's news out of Iraq in reference to the internet. Even though there's no access to the net in Iraq, they're warning against U.S. domination of the internet. I'm wondering, MK, is this a typical reaction?
Well, I think it's fair to say that the internet is largely English speaking, and many of the people and the companies on it right now are American. I also think that, though, that it's an interesting comment on democracy. We see countries that are fully dedicated to democracy tend to encourage internet use, and there is no internet use in Iraq.
Of course, we saw France, step up and say that if there's internet use as all of their laws require, it has to be in French first. And there's that whole discussion.
Yes, there are a lot of issues about that, exactly, language problems, etc.
One of the other concerns about the internet is that it does hold certain people back, and that's economically. If you don't have the money to get a computer in the home, if you don't have money to pay for an online service, etc. What about the expense of the internet as we go through this?
Well, I think we're going to see all kinds of organizations helping, like, for instance, get computers into schools and internet access that way, and that may help shrink some of the gaps between the techno-haves and have-nots. One recent charge people are talking about, as we mentioned in the last segment, is the local phone companies are asking the FCC to incur additional charges. So we'll see whether or not that happens. My previous guest, Stag Newman from Belcor, was predicting that it would not happen.
Okay, we'll see if that's the case.
Okay.
Thanks, MK. Appreciate
Thanks,
it. Back in a moment. Headlines up next.
MSNBC's 2-hour Tangled Web educational video for $29.95 plus shipping and handling. Call 1-800-314-8822.
Welcome back to MSNBC. As we continue our Tangled Web series, today we're focusing on policy and the internet. The superhighway is uncharted territory, and like any new frontier, several challenges remain to be resolved. Joining me now in the studio with a report on policy is MSNBC.com correspondent Brock Meeks. Hi, Brock.
Hi, Mary. Well, you know, Washington is really ground zero for all the major battles of the internet. And the war really first began over First Amendment rights in cyberspace. It was short and swift. The Senate Commerce Committee adopted the Communications Decency Act with little more than 47 seconds of debate. But well-organized supporters soon convinced Congress this was little more than an anti-pornography issue, and it passed overwhelmingly. But the act was soon ruled unconstitutional, leaving the U.S. Supreme Court to decide the bill's fate later this year. Washington hates a regulatory vacuum, making cyberspace a tempting legislative target, with competing interests all scrambling for control. Most of the controls likely to be placed on the internet will have the FCC's fingerprints all over them. Though the Commission preaches a hands-off policy, it stands ready to slap new rules on the industry if needed.
We want competition to decide this, and that means we need a whole bunch of rules to be thrown out and replaced with pro-competition rules.
The Federal Trade Commission has issued a report on the disturbing trend of some websites collecting a host of personal information about adults and children. The report offers no recommendations, concluding only that privacy must be addressed if consumers are to have confidence in the online marketplace. Less visible than the battle over smut is that of copyright and what constitutes a copy in cyberspace. Some proposals call for defining a copy as merely pulling up a web page on your computer screen. Do that without specific permission and, under the new definition, you're guilty of copyright violation. The most heated battles, however, involve crime and security, where the balance between personal privacy and law enforcement needs has been impossible to find. Leading that issue is the fight over encryption, programs that allow you to scramble computer messages. The FBI says the use of non-breakable encryption programs can threaten national security, providing a kind of digital safe haven for drug traffickers, child pornographers, and terrorists. The White House is willing to allow export of strong encryption programs only if those technologies deposit a spare key that law enforcement officers can access during an investigation. Encryption advocates say the White House crypto rules are out to lunch.
The terrorists who use encryption are not going to file their keys with any third party. They're just not going to do it. It won't work. It never has worked.
On a broader scale is the fear that U.S. networks could be open to cyber-terrorist attacks. To address that issue, President Clinton has authorized a panel to draft a strategy safeguarding the nation's electronic networks. As new and frontier-like as cyberspace is, there really are no new issues, just old problems, dressed in a digital dial tone, one step ahead of the law. As the federal government tries to make sense of a technology that it barely understands, the result will likely be a steady diet of regulation. Call it legislative mission creep. Without foresight, Washington will almost certainly keep the internet a tangled web. Mary?
Thanks, Brock. And we've got a few guests now that we'd like to bring in to discuss some of these issues. Bruce Taylor is the president of the National Law Center for Children and Families, and he's in our Washington, D.C. bureau. And Jerry Berman is the founder of the Center for Democracy and Technology, joining us also from Washington. Welcome. Bruce, why don't we start with you? Tell us if you think that the country needs the Communications Decency Act and why.
Well, we supported it. We wrote a brief in support of it in Congress because the internet's going to be important and it's going to be given to every child in America. They're going to put it in every school. It's going to be available in every library. And all the CDA does is tell adults who want to trade pornography pictures to put those under some kind of electronic blinder act, to put them on an adult web that kids can't get into. And it asks that ISPs restrict access of this kind of pornography for minors, and it just calls on them to use available technology to put adult material in adult hands and keep it away from kids so that children can use the web without getting exposed to dirty pictures, basically.
Okay, and Brock, I believe you have a question for our guests?
Yeah, Bruce, you know, what's really troubling about this is that the CDA, really, the Communications Decency Act, really is vague. And so while we want to keep pornography out of the hands of children, what we're really talking about here is that indecency standards are based on community standards, and because the net is global, whose standards are we going to use?
Well, it's not, Brock, and I know it may sound a little vague to people who aren't familiar with some of the legal decisions, but indecency has been limited by the courts and the FCC and the Justice Department and the Supreme Court itself to that kind of pornography that's offensive and treats sexual pornography in a way that's inappropriate for children and is not appropriate for public broadcasting. So it's not all nudity, it's not sex, it's not art and sculpture, it's not Michelangelo's David or Ulysses. It is the kind of material that you couldn't put on a news rack at a convenience store like Penthouse or Hustler. It's the kind of material that you couldn't sell to a child in a store. So we at least know what the parameters are, and the community standards are not one of local community. They are a standard of the adult community as a whole. So at least you call upon adults to use their judgment no matter where they are, the same way they do in every other walk of life. It's not a special rule, it's just the same rules.
All right, on that note, we're going to take a quick break, and we'll be back in just a moment with Bruce Taylor, Jerry Berman, and Brock Meeks. Stick with us. We're continuing our conversation now about policy issues on the internet. We've got Brock Meeks, MSNBC.com correspondent here with me in the studio, who's usually in Washington, D.C. And joining us from the nation's capital, we have Bruce Taylor, director of the National Law Center for Children and Families, and Jerry Berman, director of the Center for Democracy and Technology. And Jerry Berman, we have not had a chance to let you weigh in yet. So give us a sense of how you feel about the Communications Decency Act.
Well, from our perspective, the real issue before the nation is how to achieve the values of free speech and privacy, but also protect children and other public interests in this new media. I have no quarrel with the objectives of Bruce Taylor to try and protect children from pornography. The lawsuit that we filed against the Communications Decency Act was really not aimed at the objectives, but at the way that Congress and Bruce Taylor and others went about regulating the internet.
So, Jerry Berman, does that mean that you think that it should be up to parents and families to protect their children from the content on the web?
What we're saying is that we went to Philadelphia and challenged the Communications Decency Act and said that in this decentralized global communications media, the role of government is going to change. It cannot police the global internet. We need solutions which protect free speech and allow adults to communicate with adults, but protect children. And there are screening technologies which the court recognized. There are ways to empower parents to keep objectionable material away from their children and not turn our government into a global nanny.
But Jerry, you know, the technologies, the so-called blocking software technologies that you like to hold up as enabling parents to kind of ride herd and protect their kids, those technologies also have their own problems. And in fact, we have found out that those technologies block much more than pornography. They block political speech, they block sites like animal rights. So in fact, what you're saying is you're substituting one kind of censorship for another. How can those technologies be any better than rules laid down by the government?
I really make a very big distinction between government acting as content censor under the First Amendment and private parties. There is going to be any number of blocking technologies and different products on the market, and if you buy one that blocks too much and doesn't give you what you want and what your family wants, there are going to be other competing products. That's different when the government lays down a one rule for all and censors the net. Private censorship is the same thing. I mean, you can call it censorship, but it's also editorial judgment. Reading the New York Times, you can't find ads for adult movie theaters. If you want those, you read something else. I see no difference between the New York Times and another product on the market which blocks out sites. If you don't like it, get another product. That's very different than facing criminal penalties from the government trying to enforce a very vague standard of indecency in a new media where Bruce Taylor says, well, it's all been worked out what these rules are. That's for...
Jerry,
yes.
Let's let Bruce Taylor have a chance to respond to some of this.
Okay.
Feel free to chime in, Bruce.
Well, the good thing about the lawsuit is that even though people like Center for Democracy and Technology may think it's a vague law, once you challenge it, it goes to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court clarifies that what Congress did here is it regulated indecent pornography. It said that you use available technology to put pornography out of the reach of children, and that means that we're not scared about whether or not it touches animal rights or hate speech or Vogue magazine. It does limit the reach of the law to the kind of material that adults say you should put out of the reach of kids. It does say that industry is protected if they take steps to protect children. And then it sets the rules of the game so that everybody can live with them. And then people like Jerry Berman shouldn't be so afraid, because at least we know what the law means then.
I'm not afraid, Bruce. We went to court. You worked on this statute. We said it was unconstitutional. 6 judges have now said it's unconstitutional, and we believe the court will rule it down. What's going to be interesting, and I agree with you, we are finally going to have a debate in the Congress about what the nature of the internet is and what can we do to really protect children. Congress held no hearings, jammed a law through using the threat of hardcore pornography to scare legislators into acting. This time the court's going to say, you better look at the nature of the media and don't create a tangled web, sort it out so that you can protect free speech and protect children.
All right, well, thank you both for that debate, Bruce Taylor and Jerry Berman.
I think the stereotype is that there's nerds online, but it's not true. It's people like you and I that are using the net every day.